Hey guys, welcome back. We're in the middle of talking about European innovations in sailing technology. Boring, right? But don't worry, there's not a lot, and it is going to be incredibly important. We talked about the lateen sails last time. Those are those triangular sails that will allow Europeans to sail into the wind and go many different directions. You also need to know about the shallow draft on many of these boats. That meant that the part of the ship that extends into the water, that's the draft, was very shallow. It didn't go very far into the water, which, if you think about it advantageously, would allow the ship to do what? Go up almost to the beach, go up very close to these islands. And for an explorer, that's a big bonus. You don't have to set anchor way out in the depths and then have a little rowboat, go on forever. It can get up right up next to the land masses that you're discovering. And larger holds, that's the area of the ship for holding big objects. On the way to these places, you could think of the hold as being the area where they'd have their supplies, their water barrels. Horses were brought over in these tiny 1500s wooden sailing vessels in slings in the holds. They would have the horse actually in a sling, so it wouldn't be falling all over the place as the ship is jostling and rolling with the waves. Well, on the way back, these large areas, they could be used to haul all the tremendous amounts of gold and silver that were mined, especially by the Spanish. We will talk about that more later, but the Spanish do find enormous amounts of gold and especially silver, which actually will not be as advantageous for them as you would think. But they haul these back in their holds. That's what a hold is for. So these inventions come about during this time. They're going to enable the European age of exploration. Some of the important Portuguese explorers you need to know about who, were started off by this sponsor, this Prince Henry guy. You need to know, first of all, Bartholomew Dias. Dias, this Portuguese explorer, is going to be given credit for being the first European to sail along the west coast of Africa all the way to the bottom of the continent, to the Cape of Good Hope, and past it. So he gets down to the bottom of Africa. Um, Kind of getting us on a sea route. Remember, he's searching for a sea route to the east. And as the Portuguese start to establish inroads onto the coastline of Africa, especially West Africa, they begin to do trade and set up ports and set up factors, which is where we're going to get the term factory. This is not the same as a modern factory or what we think of with factories. These are going to be stations along the African coast where captured enslaved Africans will be held prior to their departure for other places, and later on, of course, prior to their departure for the New World, particularly across the Atlantic Ocean on their journey to the Caribbean for many of them, and to South America, and for some of them, even to North America eventually, although that will be a smaller number. For this triangular trade, as it will become known because it was actually not triangular, but it was trade. We'll talk about that later. In Africa, the trade went like this. Oftentimes, African traders would be given by the Europeans manufactured items. Think like European muskets and cannons, textiles, cloth. And in exchange, the Europeans would get African gold, ivory, salt, and most importantly, enslaved African people. This is the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade in these Portuguese factories. So the Portuguese begin the African slave trade. And a quick note about slavery. In general, yes, slavery has been around in many different forms for thousands of years. And in Africa, it had certainly existed well before the Europeans had begun to sail along the coast. There was a trans-Sahara slave trade that brought African slaves up to Europe even before the Portuguese were doing this. The difference now is the ease of access, and the demand will skyrocket once the Portuguese, the Spanish, the French, the English, these Europeans establish these agriculture, intensive labor, plantation based societies in the New World, and they can't rely on native labor because think about it, Native Americans are not going to do well with European diseases. They die off, they know the land, they can run away much easier. the Europeans need to find a reliable and cheap labor source, and that's what Africa provided. So demand skyrockets. Um, and this is going to cause warring factions in Africa to pick up even further. And so this was not everywhere, but a typical scenario would be, two African nations or tribes warring with one another. One defeats the other. Instead of killing their captured, defeated enemies, they sell them for profit to these Europeans. Well, that intensifies as demand goes up, and that's the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. Millions of Africans, particularly in the West Coast, will be transported across the infamous Middle Passage during this time period from the 1500s up through the um, very, very beginning of the 1800s. The second Portuguese explorer that you should make note of is Vasco da Gama. Da Gama goes beyond where Diaz went. Remember, Diaz goes to the bottom of the African continent, past the Cape of Good Hope. But da Gama keeps going along Africa's east coast, kind of hugging it and charting this new unknown area. He goes past Madagascar, yes, that Madagascar, across the Indian Ocean, and ends up in India. Which, cha-ching, that's what the goal was, right? To find a sea route to the east and all the riches it possessed. Da Gama becomes incredibly wealthy and incredibly famous. His trip concludes in 1498. He comes back with the word of what he discovered and everything else. He's named the governor of India, basically, for Portugal. And he is going to be 10 times more famous and renowned than Christopher Columbus. Now, 1498, keep in mind, this is several years after Columbus returns from his 1492 first voyage. And again, da Gama's voyage at the time was seen as so much more important because that was what the Western European nations had desired, a sea route to the east. And da Gama had definitely found it versus Columbus, which had found something that many people kind of were unsure. What is this? Columbus thought it was the east, but didn't really know where in the east that was. Turns out it wasn't the east at all. It was an entirely uncharted, unknown new landmass. Now, this East India trading empire, and this very important area of control for the Europeans with access to the riches of the East, that will transfer in ownership several times. So the Portuguese start off with da Gama here in the end of the 1400s. And this will transfer eventually to the Dutch trading empire, the Dutch and the Netherlands. They established this joint stock venture company, which becomes like one of the most famous and important early corporations, the Dutch East India Company. It will take control of that. And then eventually they will be usurped by the British East India Company. So here's those Portuguese explorers. Prince Henry Navigator, again, not a prince, but he's helping sponsor these guys. You're going to have Bartholomew Diaz hugging the coast, setting up important, for good and evil, African trading ports and factories, getting to the Cape of Good Hope, getting to the bottom of the African continent. And then you have da Gama, who goes further, almost ends up with South America. There's Brazil right there, which eventually the Portuguese will lay claim to, and then keeps going, hugging the East African coast, going past Madagascar, and then across the Indian Ocean and establishing connection for India, control of India by the Portuguese there. Now, what do they want? This is the desire in India: silk, spices. In the East Indies, which is Indonesia, in that area, uh, nutmeg, mace, cloves, lots of spices that are very valuable back in Europe. In China, not only spices, but silk, sugar. Ooh, sugar, we're going to talk a lot about tea, porcelain. In Japan, likewise. So these are the riches of the East. This is what those Western Europeans are desiring to get to by sea so they can cut out those middlemen, the Italian merchants who were doing this overland route to get to these things. For your Think, Pair, Share, I want you to consider what you already know about Christopher Columbus. I have a sneaking suspicion that you guys probably know a little bit about the guy from grade school. But like everything else, I want to rip up what you know and spit it out. And I want you to chew up these new facts. I realize as I'm saying this, that's a gross analogy, but I want you guys to understand that a lot of the things that you were taught when you were little were simplified versions of what actually happened. And I feel it's my responsibility in your college class to basically rip up what you know and unveil the actual horrifying truth as we know it. So here we go. Christopher Columbus, not actually how you say his name. Christophe Colomb, that's a little bit closer. He is an Italian, he's not Spanish. And remember, Italy at this time in the mid 1400s, when Columbus is born, is not actually Italy. It's a bunch of city states with these merchants. Like Venice, and where Columbus was born, Genoa. So he's Genoese. Um, he was born kind of in a middle class to poor family. He's self taught. He's an autodidact, meaning he teaches himself everything he knows and is able to quickly learn things. So pretty smart, but he didn't have much formal education. So he's considered kind of, riffraff by a lot of the academics of the time. And that's going to be important later on. Columbus is a very gifted mariner. He's a very good sailor. And some of the things he should be credited for are discovering the trade winds, the wind channels, the ocean currents that are going to make navigating the Atlantic that much more possible. Some of the things that he should absolutely be held accountable for were his treatment of the Native Americans and the fact that he was a miserable mathematician who thought he knew better than some of the great Greek philosophers and mathematicians of the ancient world. So let's talk about that for a second. Columbus, when he's trying to figure out how to find a faster route to the riches of the East, comes across the brilliant idea that, oh, if I sail west, so this is the map of the world as Columbus saw it in the 1400s. Here's Europe, here's Asia, here's Africa, and here's the rest of Asia. This is part of the Eurasian continent. So here's China, the Far East. Here's Japan. So this is what Columbus thinks is going on. He thinks, oh, everybody's trying to go this way. This is what the Portuguese are starting to do, Prince Henry and all that. Diaz goes here. Da Gama, after Columbus' first voyage, is going to go all the way around here. Columbus says, instead of trying to sail east or do all this business, which is really long, going all the way around Africa, why don't I just sail west? Okay, he calculated the circumference of the Earth to be around 21,000 miles. So Columbus thinks that the Earth is 21,000 miles in circumference. When Eratosthenes in the 3rd century BCE calculated the Earth's circumference, he got 25,000 miles. So already, and by the way, Eratosthenes was only about 100 miles off. So already Columbus is off on his calculations. But wait, it's going to get worse. Next thing is, because this is how he views the world, okay, neglecting the fact that there's these major land masses of North and South America in the middle of this, plus the giant Pacific Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean being a lot larger, Columbus thinks that it's only going to be about 3,000 miles to get across from Europe over to the Far East by sailing west. So he thinks of the 21,000 miles across the circumference of the Earth, only 3,000 miles to get from here to here. In actuality, okay, and mathematicians in Europe and the courts of these kingdoms knew that the Earth was round. Okay, that was not a question. Columbus, yes, he knew the Earth was round. So did they. But they also believed that the ancient Greek mathematician Eratosthenes was correct. They believed that Pythagoras, who said the Earth was round, was correct. They already knew all of this. And they also knew one other thing, that the distance between these land masses was much greater, more like 15,000 miles. And no sailing vessel during the 1400s would have been capable of that sort of distance. So major miscalculation, fatal miscalculation on Columbus's part. And this is why, as he's going around to the various European monarchs and their courts and begging for financial support for his mission, they all laugh in his face and deny him until he gets to Spain because King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella had just completed something called